Have you ever wondered how bread is made? Why are such substances like yeast and flour so instrumental in its production? And how could different amounts of such substances affect how bread tastes, looks, and smells? Hi, I'm Dylan, and I'll be hopefully answering most of those questions today in my bread talk. What is bread made of? At its core, most bread is made by mixing different amounts of flour, water, fat, salt, and of course, yeast. For today, I'll be focusing on two of those main components, flour and yeast. Specifically, I'll be covering how does the amount of yeast affect how bread tastes, looks, and smells, and how does the type of flour affect how bread tastes, looks, and smells. 1. How does the amount of yeast affect how bread tastes, looks, and smells? What is yeast? The type of yeast commonly used in bread making, or Saccharomyces cerevisiae, are single-celled fungi that break down carbohydrates to get energy and the molecules they need to function. An example of such carbohydrates could be sugar. The yeast can perform this task in two separate ways: the oxygen-dependent aerobic pathway and the oxygen-independent anaerobic pathway, which is also called fermentation. When baking bread, yeast can use both pathways, but they normally prefer to start with the anaerobic process of fermentation. In this process, ethanol is produced in addition to CO2, as shown in this part of the chart. In the aerobic or oxygen-dependent pathway, the yeast consumes some of the sugar and produces carbon dioxide gas, or CO2, and water, as shown in this part of the chart. In both processes, the gases that the yeast creates accumulates and creates tiny bubbles. These bubbles get trapped by gluten and create a sponge-like structure. This process is commonly called fermentation or rising, and is what gives yeast-leavened bread their soft texture and a distinct aroma. And as a result of this expanding gas, the bread dough inflates or rises. For my research, I interviewed Jessica Liang, a baker that has been perfecting her sandwich bread recipe for 45 years. She perfected her recipe via a combination of experimentation and online research. I asked her about the optimal amount of yeast used in bread making, and through experimentation, she has found that for every 500 grams of flour you add, the optimal amount of yeast to use is 5 to 6 grams, which is roughly a 1 to 100 yeast to flour ratio. She also explains that too much yeast shortens the fermentation period, and if you add too much, the smell and flavor of the bread will resemble that of chemicals or medicine. The opposite is also true. If you add too little yeast, it's harder for the bread to ferment or rise properly. In some cases, if you add too little yeast, the dough will not rise at all. The only part of bread's appearance affected by yeast is size. The aforementioned rising process creates an increase in volume, which is a physical change. 2. How does the type of flour affect how bread tastes, looks, and smells? What is flour? Flour is a powder ground from grains, typically wheat. Grains are the edible seeds harvested from cereal plants. These seeds have three parts: the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. The bran is what protects the seed until it is ready to grow. The germ is where growth begins, and the endosperm acts like a food store for the developing grain, usually containing starch with protein and other nutrients. We humans want that food too, so we hijack the stored energy in the form of proteins commonly known as gluten. Gluten is made up of two types of protein, gliadin and glutenin. The ratio of these components varies, and some combinations are better than others for certain tasks, like making bread. Flour is what provides the structure in baked goods. If we did not add it into bread, they would not be bread, and instead just a mess of fat, sugar, yeast, and water. The protein content is the primary differentiator between several types of flour. High-protein wheat varieties, which are 10 to 14% protein, are classed as hard wheat. Low-protein wheat varieties, which are 5 to 10% protein, are known as soft wheat. More protein equals more gluten, which equals more strength. The more strength the dough has, the more volume it gains and the chewier the texture. From the example as shown in this video, I create this strength by working the dough. As you can see, after I worked the dough got stretchier and more elastic. Let's check it out. As you can see, I'm working the dough. And as the dough is working, it's forming gluten bonds, which is represented by the lack of dough now sticking to the walls of the mixer. And now I'm stretching the dough. And do you see how elastic that is? How elastic and stretchy that is? That is the result of the strength created by the gluten bonds. From this, many types of flours have been made and produced. These flours include all-purpose flour, cake flour, pastry flour, bread flour, self-rising flour, whole wheat flour, and gluten-free flour. Today we'll be focusing on all-purpose, cake, and bread flours, as all the rest are either similar or variations of these, except for gluten-free flour. All-purpose flour. Recipes that require flour usually require all-purpose flour, made from a combination of a milled mixture of both soft and hard wheat. All-purpose flour has a moderate protein content in 10 to 12% range. All-purpose flour is a jack of all trades. While not the best for all purposes, it's capable of producing pie crusts, biscuits, cakes, and bread. That is why most common households buy this type of flour. You can buy this for bread and still use the rest for nearly any other purpose. Cake flour. Cake flour is the flour with the lowest protein content, 5 to 8%. This lack of gluten-forming proteins makes cake flour amazing for tender baked goods, such as cakes, muffins, biscuits, scones, and more. Cake flour is chlorinated, a bleaching process that further weakens the gluten proteins and alters the flour's starch to increase its capacity to absorb more liquid and sugar, ensuring a moist cake. Using cake flour to bake bread is counterintuitive, since you want to have more protein to create more gluten to create a chewier texture. Plus, if you did not have strong enough gluten bonds, then all the gases created by the yeast would escape, and thus the bread would not gain much volume. Bread flour. Bread flour contains a protein content of 12 to 14%, meaning it is the strongest of all flours, providing the most structural support. This is especially important in yeast, leaven/yeasted bread, where a strong gluten network is required to contain the gases produced by the yeast during fermentation. In addition to not only a better volume and a chewier texture, it also results in more browning on the crust, which is delicious. Using bread flour to make bread is the best choice, since it's going to produce the best bread in terms of texture, crust, and volume. In regards to how different types of flour affect how bread smells, it appears that the type of flour does not affect the bread smell greatly. The smell should end up the same no matter what flour you choose. In conclusion, I am satisfied with the answers I have found to my questions. Regarding how the amount of yeast affects bread, I have found that the amount of yeast that you add to bread is especially important in making it soft and giving it its distinct aroma. Regarding how the type of flour affects bread, I have concluded that the type of flour you add determines how much volume the bread gains and what the texture is. Now armed with this knowledge, I hope that the next time you bake bread, it will turn out better than ever.